Today I'll be presenting my thesis project, which is entitled Characterizations of Veganism in Online News Media. Veganism is defined by the Vegan Society as a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. There's a lot of ways that veganism is incorporated into somebody's daily living habits, but the most important part is going to be the vegan diet, which is a plant-based diet avoiding all animal foods, which includes meat, dairy, eggs, and honey. So despite the fact that veganism has grown in popularity significantly in the last few years, there's still a pretty strong stigma against this particular lifestyle and those who practice it. A study from a few years ago found that the prejudice expressed by meat eaters towards vegans and vegetarians is, quote, at least as negative as that expressed towards immigrants, and is even more negative than racism expressed towards Black people. Similarly, vegans often report experiencing bias or discrimination based on their lifestyle choice, and they often experience strain or conflict within their own interpersonal relationships once they tell people that they are vegan. So the purpose of my study was essentially to figure out, what does anti-vegan stigma look like? How prevalent is it? How do anti-vegan attitudes manifest in public discourses such as media? And how does this affect the way people think about this ideology? I wanted to look at online news media to answer these questions because these platforms are a really good way to get an image of public opinion. The news that we read shapes our opinions, and our opinions inform the way news media functions in turn. So I wanted to look at the way veganism is presented in news media to gain a better understanding of how people think about this topic and how people learn about this topic. I identified the 6 most popular online sources for news using the most recent available data from the Pew Research Center. These ended up being Fox News, CNN, the Daily Mail, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and USA Today. I searched every publication's website for the keyword vegan and compiled all of the results from the year 2018, which totaled 652 articles, and I read them and analyzed them all for the way they portrayed vegans. Every article was evaluated as portraying vegans positively, negatively, or neutrally, and then I divided the negative categories into even further and more specific ways by which vegans or veganism are criticized in that article. I'll elaborate on this further later, but I ended up also splitting neutral characterizations by their relevance to the actual topic of veganism and divided those into relevant and sort of irrelevant categories. Of the 652 articles I read, the majority, 53.6%, contain negative characterizations of vegans or veganism. Articles falling into the neutral category, which were those that, of course, mentioned vegans or veganism without any value judgment attached, constituted 42% of the sample. And positive articles, which were those that portrayed vegans or veganism in a sympathetic or favorable light, appeared in the sample least frequently. Those were about 4.3% of the total number of articles that I evaluated. Within the negative category, I was able to identify 8 dominant recurring themes. These themes were, in order of frequency from most to least commonly appearing: ridiculing vegans or veganism, characterizing veganism as difficult or impossible to sustain, characterizing veganism as a form of asceticism, characterizing vegans as oversensitive, characterizing vegans as hostile, describing veganism as faddish, characterizing veganism as a threat to culture or tradition, and characterizing vegans as hypocritical and or dishonest. I'd now like to elaborate a little bit on each one of these categories and talk about specifically what I mean and how these themes manifested in the articles. So the most common type of negative characterization of vegans was that of vegans as ridiculous, unreasonable, trivial, or focused on frivolous pursuits, or just generally deserving of mockery. A total of 103 articles, or 15.8% of the total sample, contained these kinds of characterizations. I've included an example here from a Daily Mail article in which the author refers to vegans as, quote, a woolly-headed bunch of tofu munchers. Another common negative characterization was that of veganism as a form of asceticism, a sort of severe self-disciplinarian form of abstention from any kind of enjoyable eating or social experience. And this appeared in 80 articles, or 12.2% of the total sample. So I've highlighted some examples here in which veganism was referred to as strict, restrictive, joyless, and stringent at different points throughout the sample. The next type of negative characterization was that of veganism as being difficult or impossible to sustain, and that appeared in 90 articles, or 13.8% of the total sample. This top quote was from a woman who says that she, quote, went vegan, but found it difficult to get enough protein, which suggests that veganism is unhealthy and therefore not something that somebody can sustain for a very long time. This second quote, which suggests that avocados, almonds, kiwi, butternut squash, and melon are not vegan friendly because they require bees to be farmed, also suggests that vegan food is hard or almost impossible to find, and sets a very high bar for vegans. Another common negative characterization was that of vegans as dishonest or hypocritical. This appeared in 38 articles, or 5.8% of the total sample. I have this top quote here in which Marla Maples is referred to as, quote, a clean eating vegan who occasionally eats steak, which suggests that she's adopted the label vegan, but is dishonest and continuing to eat meat anyway. And then this second quote, which is from an article about actress Alicia Silverstone, who's a vegan, suggests that there's hypocrisy inherent in her simultaneously being vegan and enjoying watching MMA, because the author says, bloody humans, it turns out, are fine. The next type of negative characterization of veganism involved the implication that it's just a fad, a shallow or fleeting trend that's not sticking around for a long time. This appeared in 64 articles, or 9.8% of the total sample. And I've highlighted an example here in which Beyonce is described as having embraced veganism, and the article suggests that this is not the first time that she has, quote, dabbled with it, and suggests that the times that she was vegan were, quote, phases, which contributes to the image of veganism as being very shallowly motivated or just a temporary, fleeting fad. Vegans were also often depicted as overly sensitive, easily offended, or emotionally soft. This type of characterization appeared in 79 articles, or 12.1% of the total sample. And the example I've pulled out here is from an article about River Phoenix, who is vegan, and the author says that he, quote, once fled a restaurant in tears after his girlfriend ordered shellfish. The next type of negative characterization was that of vegans as hostile. This appeared in 75 articles, or 11.5% of the total sample, and I have examples here that range from accusations of harassment, in which vegans are described as keyboard warriors or jeering at people, to threats or actual physical violence, in which this second quote, in which family-run butchers say that they've been terrorized by vegans who have threatened to petrol bomb their store. Another common type of negative characterization of vegans was that of veganism as posing a threat to culture or tradition. This theme appeared in 50 articles, or 7.6% of the total sample. And I have this top quote here, which suggests that vegans are, quote, not just coming after your hamburgers, though they are, they want to change the way that you speak, and they're going after your language. So this was written in response to PETA proposing that we replace phrases like beating a dead horse with phrases like feeding a fed horse that don't depict violence against animals. And the response to this in this article here suggests that vegans pose a threat to established linguistic tradition by banning widely used beloved phrases from the English language, but it also suggests that vegans pose a greater threat to American values of freedom of speech and individual liberty in general by, quote, going after our language. This second quote suggests that millennials are identifying with witchcraft and also adopting vegan diets as opposed to eating meat, and suggests that both of these things pose a threat to Christianity, which is the dominant religion in America. And this implies that veganism poses something of a threat to established religious customs as well. Now on to neutral characterizations, which comprised 42% of the total sample. 70% of these neutral characterizations of vegans or veganism actually occurred in contexts that were by and large unrelated to veganism. These tended to be passing, sort of coincidental uses of the word vegan, often to describe some sort of consumer good or a restaurant review or a travel guide or something like that. I have some examples of these neutral characterizations that don't really deal with the topic of veganism at all. So this first example describes a shampoo line as vegan, the second one refers to potato chips as vegan, and then the third one is just discussing a line of products in a grocery store, and it describes them as vegan. So none of these statements have anything negative to say about veganism, and they're certainly presented in a neutral context, but rather than reflecting an actually unbiased or neutral opinion of vegans, it just seems to be that the authors don't really have anything to say about veganism at all. So these kind of appearances made up 70% of all of these neutral characterizations. So that was actually the case with many of the positive articles as well. The positive category was the smallest in the sample, making up just 4.3% of the total. And even though every article in this category spoke favorably or sympathetically about vegans, most of them were focused on the non-ideological or ethical perks of veganism or motivations for going vegan. So, for example, I saw a number of articles that opted to talk about the health benefits of the vegan diet, such as this top one where Dennis Kucinich is described as having gone vegan because it reduces the effects of his Crohn's disease. And I also saw a number of articles speak highly about veganism, specifically for its ability to aid in weight loss or to promote physical beauty, such as this second example where Alicia Silverstone is described as having maintained her youthful features over the years because she's vegan. So that's, of course, a good result from veganism, and it's a positive way to talk about it, but it doesn't deal with any of the ethical or ideological motives behind veganism. There were actually only 7 occurrences of a pro vegan discourse that directly address the ideological underpinnings behind abstaining from animal products. 6 of those dealt strictly with environmental benefits of veganism, such as this third quote, which talks about how vegan replacements for meat made out of soy and wheat are better regarding greenhouse gas emissions than animal based foods. And there were a handful of other articles with sort of similar theses about veganism being a way to reduce your carbon footprint. The only other instance of a pro vegan article that engaged with the ethical platform behind veganism, and actually the only pro vegan article in the entire sample to directly address the topic of animal exploitation, was this single letter to the editor of USA Today. And this is a little letter written by Heather Moore, who is a writer at PETA, and she is writing this in response to an article that USA Today published about a cow who essentially went viral on social media for being very tall, and that ended up saving him from the slaughterhouse. So this is the entire text of the letter to the editor. It's very short, and it ends with a plea to consider eating vegan foods if you found that article about that cow to be compelling. There were no articles published in the year of 2018 in any of these 6 publications that really engaged with this topic at great length. Out of 652 articles on veganism, just this one letter to the editors is speaking about animal welfare concerns. Given that a study published in 2019 showed that 70.4% of all vegans cite concerns over animal welfare as a motive for being vegan, this represents a huge disconnect between the values and concerns of actual vegans and the way they're presented in the media, that only 1 out of 652 articles address this concept. So the results of this study have shown that the discourse surrounding vegans and veganism in the mainstream media remains predominantly negative. Over half of all occurrences of the keyword vegan in 6 major online news sources appeared in negative contexts, in which vegans were characterized as ridiculous, ascetics, oversensitive, hostile, and dishonest, and the vegan lifestyle was labeled difficult or impossible to sustain and a threat to culture and tradition in general. Even when veganism was discussed neutrally and without judgment, it often was only in passing, and the articles that mentioned veganism with completely neutral language tended to be reviews of products or services or restaurants suitable for vegans. And while each of those cases on its own might not seem to have a notable impact on the general public's understanding of the vegan ideology, this consistent discussion of veganism appearing only in the context of consumer decisions might have the overall effect of causing veganism to seem like it's an apathetically motivated purchasing decision rather than an entire, very well thought out lifestyle choice motivated by ethical concerns. Even the unambiguously, totally positive portrayals of vegans might still subtly reinforce this idea that it lacks ethical or political foundations by focusing almost exclusively on aesthetic or personal health benefits of going vegan. If you'll recall, just 7 articles in the entire sample spoke positively about veganism from an ethical or political perspective, and just one of these focused specifically on animal welfare issues, even though that's the number one reason that people cite for going vegan in the first place. So we can infer a few things about the public's perception of veganism based on these results. First, the generally negative depiction of vegan individuals has the effect of discrediting vegans as a whole. The consistent depictions of vegans as foolish, irrational, insincere, dishonest, and aggressive is going to inform the public's understanding of vegans as unworthy of attention or participation in public discussions. Second, the news media's consistent criticism of veganism leads to not just vegan people, but also that entire lifestyle and its underlying ideology itself being called into question. By depicting veganism as logically inconsistent or ethically inconsistent, or so difficult and unpleasant to undertake that it's not worth attempting or even considering seriously, or just plain laughable and ridiculous, the media's presentation of veganism is going to function to render it very simple to dismiss and ignore. And third, the cumulative result of the consistent dismissal of vegan people and veganism is going to be that the social acceptability of eating animals and animal byproducts is reinforced. This might have the effect of mitigating cognitive dissonance in meat eaters who simultaneously hold pro-animal beliefs, because one method of reducing the uncomfortable dissonance that arises from holding contradictory perspectives might be to assert that eating meat is necessary and therefore impossible to avoid. By discrediting and dismissing vegans who, just by existing, challenge that assertion, and thereby labeling them unworthy of being listened to, that dissonance reducing belief that meat eating is inevitable is going to remain unchallenged. In protecting the established norm of meat eating, anti vegan sentiment also mitigates threats to the cultural values that meat eating represents. So, meat eating has close symbolic ties to traditional norms of masculinity and American culture more broadly, and the rejection of meat eating in favor of a vegan lifestyle poses a threat to these established social facts. In this sense, the condemnation of vegans as laughable or dishonest or dangerous, this is also going to function to neutralize challenges to the status quo, as it's going to render vegans a no longer credible threat to our established social values. Overall, it's safe to say that the overwhelmingly negative perception of veganism will probably remain negative for quite a while, given that these anti vegan attitudes presented in the media serve the function of blocking threats to established social norms. And that concludes my presentation today on my thesis project, Characterizations of Vegans in Online News Media. Thank you for listening.